The strangest thing just happened, see, and almost nobody in mainstream media is talking about it the way they should. Mexico just cut oil shipments to Cuba. And if you think that's just a routine trade adjustment, you're missing the entire architecture of pressure that forced that decision. This isn't diplomacy. This is economic coercion dressed in diplomatic clothing, and it's coming directly from Washington. Here's what you need to understand. Cuba has depended on Mexican oil as a lifeline ever since Venezuela's own supply capacity collapsed under US sanctions. Remove Mexico from that equation and you're not just reducing barrels, you're strangling an island of 11 million people into submission. That is the strategic intent. President Claudia Sheinbaum is now speaking out, but watch how she's speaking. There's a careful, measured quality to her words, the language of a leader caught between sovereignty and survival. Mexico shares a border and an economy, with the country applying the pressure. That is not a coincidence, that is the leverage. What we're watching in real time is the Trump administration reasserting the Monroe Doctrine, not as a historical footnote but as an operating policy. Latin America is being reminded, one nation at a time, who controls the hemisphere. And let me take you back, just briefly, to understand how we arrived at this precise moment, because context is everything when you're trying to read geopolitical moves correctly. You cannot understand what Trump is doing to Cuba through Mexico without understanding the longer arc of American foreign policy in Latin America. This isn't new, this isn't original, this is a pattern that has repeated itself for over a century, and the fact that it's repeating again right now in 2025 under a different administration tells you something profound about the permanent state, the institutional machinery that operates regardless of which face sits in the Oval Office. Cuba has been under American economic sanctions since 1962. Let that sink in for a moment. 60-plus years of embargo, multiple generations of Cubans have been born, lived their entire lives, and died under the weight of that economic blockade. And in all that time, the Cuban government never collapsed. The revolution never folded. The island never surrendered to Washington's terms. That is an extraordinary fact, one that the mainstream American narrative rarely acknowledges with the honesty it deserves. Instead, what you hear is that Cuba is poor because of communism, because of mismanagement, because of ideology, and while governance certainly plays a role, the dominant factor, the one that dwarfs everything else, is 6 decades of deliberate economic strangulation by the most powerful nation on earth. So when Venezuela, under Hugo Chavez, began supplying Cuba with oil at preferential rates in the early 2000s, it was genuinely transformative. It was a lifeline. Cuba could keep its electricity on, keep its transportation moving, keep its economy breathing, and Washington noticed. Washington always notices. The pressure on Venezuela that followed, the coup attempt in 2002, the economic warfare, the sanctions, the repeated destabilization efforts, was not unrelated to Venezuela's decision to support Cuba. When you help someone Washington wants isolated, you invite Washington's attention onto yourself. That's how the system works. Venezuela's oil production capacity has since collapsed. A combination of mismanagement, brain drain, and relentless US sanctions reduced PDVSA, once one of the most capable national oil companies in the Western Hemisphere, to a shadow of its former self. Venezuelan oil shipments to Cuba became unreliable, then insufficient, then effectively ended, and into that vacuum stepped Mexico. Under AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, Mexico quietly became Cuba's most important energy partner. AMLO was many things, but one thing he was consistently was resistant to American pressure when it came to sovereignty and non-interventionism. He had an old-school Latin American leftist's instinct about these things. He wasn't going to let Washington dictate who Mexico could trade with. But AMLO is gone now. Claudia Sheinbaum is president, and the situation she inherited is far more complicated than the one her predecessor navigated, because the Trump administration, in its second term, is playing this game with far greater aggression and far less pretense than before. Trump's team has made clear, through both formal diplomatic channels and through the kind of informal pressure that never quite makes it into the official record, that Mexico's relationship with Cuba is not acceptable, and so the oil shipments have been cut, and Sheinbaum is speaking out, carefully, cautiously, but speaking out nonetheless. Now, I want you to think carefully about what this moment actually represents, because it's easy to look at this as a Cuba story. It isn't. Not primarily. Cuba is almost incidental here. What this is, fundamentally, is a Mexico story, and a story about the limits of sovereignty for any nation that shares geography and economic integration with the United States. Mexico is not a small or inconsequential country. It has a population of roughly 130 million people. It has the second largest economy in Latin America. It has one of the most significant oil industries in the Western Hemisphere through Pemex. It shares not just a border with the United States but an entire economic architecture, the USMCA trade agreement, supply chains that are deeply interlocked, remittance flows, labor migration, the whole complex web of interdependence that makes it genuinely difficult to say where the Mexican economy ends and the American economy begins in certain sectors. Mexico is not Cuba, Mexico is not Nicaragua, Mexico is not a small island that can be pressured with relative ease, and yet here we are, watching Mexico bend to Washington's will on a third country issue. That is the story. That is what you should be watching. Because if Mexico, a country of 130 million people with the economic and geographic weight that it carries, cannot maintain an independent energy trade relationship with a neighboring Caribbean island without facing pressure severe enough to force a policy reversal, then what exactly does sovereignty mean in the American hemisphere? The answer, if you're being honest, is that it means very little. It means you can have the symbols of sovereignty, a flag, a president, a constitution, a national anthem, but the substance of sovereignty, the actual ability to make decisions about your own foreign policy without asking Washington's permission first, that is something that is simply not available to most countries in Latin America, and that is not an accident, it is a design. Sheinbaum's public statements have been careful. She hasn't come out and said the United States forced us to do this. She hasn't said we are capitulating to American pressure. What she has said is framed in the language of regulatory compliance, of energy sector priorities, of domestic Mexican considerations, and I understand why. She is a pragmatist operating in an extraordinarily difficult environment. Mexico needs the United States far more than the United States needs Mexico in the short term, or at least that's how the power asymmetry is perceived and experienced at the political level. The trade dependency is real. The border is real. The leverage is real. She cannot afford an open confrontation with Washington over Cuba's oil supply. The political cost would be enormous, and she knows it. But here's what's interesting, Andu, and this is where I think the deeper reading becomes important. She is speaking out at all. She is not simply staying silent. She is not pretending this didn't happen or that there was no pressure. There is something in her public positioning that suggests she wants the Mexican public, and perhaps the broader Latin American public, to understand that this decision was not made freely, that there is a context, that there is a pressure. She is not naming it explicitly, but she is pointing toward it, and that matters because it is a form of resistance, limited, constrained, but real. It is the resistance available to a leader who cannot afford direct confrontation, but refuses to completely pretend that the emperor has clothes. Now let's talk about Cuba directly for a moment, because the human dimension of this cannot be ignored. Cuba is already in one of the worst energy crises in its modern history. The island has been experiencing blackouts of 8, 10, 12 hours a day in recent months. In some parts of the country, people have been going without electricity for even longer. The food system is under severe stress. The healthcare system, once genuinely one of the proudest achievements of the Cuban Revolution, a system that was exporting doctors to dozens of countries around the world, is now struggling to maintain basic functionality because of fuel shortages, medicine shortages, and the brain drain of medical professionals who have left the country seeking better economic conditions. This is the reality on the ground in Cuba right now, and into that reality comes the news that Mexico has cut its oil supply. I want you to think about what that means for a family in Havana, or in Santiago de Cuba, or in any of the smaller towns across that island. This isn't an abstraction. This is whether the hospital has enough fuel to run its generators. This is whether the bus that takes workers to their jobs can actually run. This is whether the water pumping system that gets water to apartment buildings has the electricity it needs to operate. The geopolitics of oil supply, at the level where it touches ordinary human lives, is extraordinarily brutal, and the people making these decisions in Washington, in the think tanks, in the policy apparatus that designs and implements these sanctions and these pressure campaigns, they know this. They know exactly what the human consequences are. The suffering is not an unintended side effect. It is, to a significant degree, the mechanism. The idea is to make life difficult enough for ordinary Cubans that they turn against their government. That has been the theory for 60 years, and for 60 years it hasn't worked, but that hasn't stopped them from continuing to apply it. What this episode also reveals is something important about the Trump administration's second-term approach to Latin America more broadly. This isn't isolated. You're seeing the same pattern in multiple places simultaneously. The pressure on Colombia over deportation flights earlier this year, the aggressive posture toward Panama regarding the canal, the rhetoric around Mexico, and the cartels that has flirted openly with the idea of military intervention on Mexican territory. There is a coherent regional strategy here, even if it isn't always articulated as such in the official policy documents. The strategy is reassertion. It is the reassertion of American dominance in the Western Hemisphere at a moment when that dominance has been, from Washington's perspective, dangerously eroded. The Chinese presence in Latin America through infrastructure investment, trade relationships, and diplomatic engagement has grown enormously over the past 2 decades. The Russians maintain relationships with Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. The BRICS expansion has drawn in several Latin American countries or near members. From the perspective of the American strategic establishment, the hemisphere is slipping, and the Trump administration has decided that the moment for polite diplomatic management has passed. What you're seeing now is harder-edged reassertion. And Mexico is central to that reassertion, not just because of Cuba, but because of everything Mexico represents strategically. Mexico is the linchpin of American economic and security interests in the region. Control Mexico, or more precisely, ensure that Mexico remains within Washington's orbit and does not develop genuinely independent foreign policy reflexes, and you have enormous leverage over the rest of Latin America. Lose Mexico, even partially, even in the direction of greater neutrality or independent positioning, and the whole regional architecture becomes more complicated. So the pressure on Sheinbaum over Cuba should be read not just as being about Cuba, it should be read as a message, a demonstration, a reminder of who sets the rules. What I find most analytically interesting in all of this is the question of durability. How durable is this kind of pressure? Because there is a paradox at the heart of American hard power in Latin America, and it has been visible for decades if you know how to look. The harder Washington squeezes, the more it generates exactly the kind of political dynamics it is trying to prevent. Every time Washington applies this kind of heavy-handed pressure, every time it forces a country to bend publicly on a sovereignty issue, it creates resentment. It creates political space for opposition movements to say, look, this is what dependence on the United States looks like. It is fuel for exactly the kind of anti-American political sentiment that produces the Chavezes and the Morales and the leaders who eventually push back harder. The short-term tactical win tends to generate long-term strategic complications. Sheinbaum herself is a case study in this dynamic. She came to power on a platform that was broadly continuous with AMLO's nationalist, sovereignty-focused approach. Her base expects a certain degree of independent posture from her. Every time she is seen bending to American pressure, and her base is watching, Latin America is watching, the global South is watching, she pays a political cost domestically. She deposits resentment into a political bank account that will eventually be drawn upon, not necessarily by her, but by whoever comes after. The pressure produces the resistance it always has. And then there is the broader global context, which matters enormously here. We are living through a moment of genuine transition in the international order. The dollar's position as the unchallenged global reserve currency is being questioned seriously for the first time in decades, not because the dollar is about to collapse, but because alternatives are being actively constructed and discussed in ways that would have been dismissed as fantasy just 10 years ago. The BRICS countries are developing payment systems that bypass the dollar. China and Russia are trading in their own currencies. Saudi Arabia has made clear that it is no longer automatically aligned with American preferences in the way it was during the unipolar moment. The global South is increasingly asserting itself, imperfectly, inconsistently, but genuinely, in international forums. The world that American foreign policy was designed to manage is changing underneath the feet of the policymakers who are trying to manage it. In that context, the hard reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine that we're watching play out, the forcing of Mexico to cut oil to Cuba, the pressure across Latin America, it reads differently than it would have in, say, 1995. In 1995, American power in the hemisphere was so overwhelming that this kind of pressure was essentially invisible. It happened, but it happened quietly because it didn't need to be noisy. The targets complied because the power gap was so enormous. Today, the compliance still happens, as we can see with Mexico and Cuba, but it happens in a context of visible resistance, of public statements, of regional politics that are more complicated, of external powers offering alternative relationships. The pressure is louder now precisely because it has to be. because the quiet version isn't sufficient anymore. That is the deeper signal in this story, not just that Trump forced Mexico to cut oil to Cuba, not just that Sheinbaum is speaking out. The deeper signal is that we are watching a hegemon working harder than it used to have to work to maintain what used to be automatic. And when a hegemon has to work harder to maintain what was once automatic, you are watching, in slow motion, imperfectly, with many steps backward along the way, the beginning of the end of a particular kind of power. History doesn't move in straight lines. Empires don't fall overnight, but they do fall. And the moments when you can see the effort behind the dominance, the strain, the overreach, the need to force what was once freely given, those moments are worth paying very close attention to. That is what this story is really about. And that is why it matters far beyond the oil shipments themselves.